So hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to be attempting to platinum Kena Bridge of Spirits. This game released a few years back in 2021 and was instantly labelled as one of the hardest platinums of that year. I'm not really one for difficult and soul-crushing games, so I stuffed the game away for safekeeping until I was ready to attempt it. Fast forward to the game's 1 year anniversary, and the developers added a free DLC, which includes a new Game Plus mode, bringing the platinum difficulty right down to a solid 5 out of 10. They also added the option to start the game from the hardest difficulty, which was an amazing choice because before the update, the hardest difficulty would only unlock after beating the game for the first time. This essentially gave me two options: start the game on normal difficulty, playing through the game and upgrading my character before hitting up New Game Plus for the easy platinum. Or I could try my luck at earning the platinum trophy the way it was intended, starting right out on Master Spirit mode and seeing how hard the game actually is. This decision would later come to haunt me, but for now, I set out on what would be an amazing but extremely hard journey to grab this platinum trophy. Also, major spoilers ahead if you haven't played this game before.
Why have you come?
I sense suffering here, Spirit. Do you need help?
You know nothing of suffering. This is my home, my village. Turn back, Spirit Guide.
This spirit is someone we later know as Toshi and plays a pretty important part in the story towards the end of the game. Pretty much straight away, we can earn the first trophy for finding our first rot. Rots are little creatures that serve not only as a collectible, but also as an addition to the combat system that will be introduced shortly. After collecting 5 rots, the game gives a brief tutorial about clearing the corruption, and then we enter the first combat section of the game. This section was the first instance of using the rot in combat, and I actually think it's such a unique take on a proven method from other games. When a fight starts, the rots will hide, and you need to build their courage back up in order to use the abilities. The two ways to do this are either by defeating enemies without taking damage, or by picking up these yellow objects dropped on the floor called courage drops. These courage drops usually give the rots a courage boost of about half a circle, which definitely helped me late game. Once the circle is full of courage, we can use the rots to our advantage by having them deal a certain amount of damage, which earns us another trophy. This feature became a bit more useful later on, as more rot abilities are eventually introduced, but for now, I made quick work of the remaining enemies before stumbling across the first major fight of the game.
Let me help you. I can heal these spirits and restore balance to the forest.
I know you are kind. You sense the power that flows through this land, but you do not fully understand it.
This land can be healed, but you cannot stay here, Spirit. You must move on.
You are the one who does not belong. I will never abandon my people.
This fight was a pretty difficult one, as there hadn't been much information regarding the combat except for the little enemies from a few minutes prior. This left me with little knowledge going into this fight, and well, you can probably tell how this turned out. What started to happen though was that after every death, I would slowly learn more and more about the enemy's moveset, and eventually, this happened. After defeating what I will class as the tutorial boss, we get greeted by 2 children called Benny and Satiire. They state that their brother is lost in the forest, and if we can help them, they will take us to the mountain shrine. This then prompts the first out of 3 storylines within this game, and after reaching the village, we can earn another trophy. We then meet this old guy called Satiire, who explains that in this world, spirits cannot pass to the other side if they have unfinished business to attend to, and that it is our job to help these spirits bridge to the other side. He also states that the brother of Benny and Satiire is called Toro. but has become a spirit and is unable to pass, making it our first major task of the game. We are given Toro's mask and sent on our way to hopefully help Toro pass to the other side without any problems. Before even starting the Toro section, I stumbled across a collectible called Spirit Mail. These allow us to open the gates blocking the corruption and cleanse the area to help a few spirits. It was also in this section that I managed to grab the trophy Triple Threat for defeating 3 enemies with a single parry. I have to quickly point out that parrying in this game has to be basically frame perfect or else it fails to work. I know parrying in this game is a major way to complete later fights, but I rarely use it to my advantage because I just couldn't master it properly. But either way, after getting a successful parry on these smaller enemies, I managed to pop the trophy. And then, after cleansing the corruption, we can earn another trophy for simply taking a picture within photo mode. A little bit later on, we can stumble across a new type of enemy, and after managing to defeat it without destroying its shield, yet another trophy popped. We then get introduced to another unique way of using the rots, before being chucked into the hardest encounter I had faced thus far. The issue with this one is that it's pretty much just a tutorial boss on steroids. You have to focus up on the big guy without taking damage from the little enemies too, and as you may have guessed, this took more than a few tries. But as I mentioned earlier, the more deaths that occurred, the more I learned about the fight, and eventually I did manage to do it. This successful fight led into a glimpse of what actually happened to Toro before he turned into a spirit. There wasn't much to go off, but it allowed me to slowly piece together the story and the task at hand, before Kana states that we need to find 3 relics in order to find Toro. And then, we head on our way towards Rusu's house, which is actually where I cleansed the first flower shrine of the playthrough by using a forest tear. The path towards Rusu's house involved a lot of climbing, fighting, and of course, more deaths. This wouldn't be the only section I would die in though, as literally 5 minutes later, we are introduced to what I could easily class as a boss battle. This was the first encounter that really had me stumped, as it was just completely different to every other boss I had previously defeated. To defeat this one, you have to build up enough courage in order to stun Kappa and then go in for a few lethal hits before backing off and repeating. About halfway through the fight, Kappa will spawn in 3 tougher enemies for you to defeat, while also constantly being in the background trying to damage you at the same time. This fight luckily took me only about 8 tries, but it was a very clear indication as to where this game was heading. Finally, we were able to meet Rusu, and he was kind enough to give us a bow for our troubles, allowing us to unlock another story trophy.
Try using your bow on these targets.
This bow was probably the most useful addition in the game so far, as it allowed for range combat. After a quick tutorial with the bow, we were off to find the first relic of Toro's storyline. And I don't really know what I was expecting, but it definitely wasn't for the first major boss of the game just to appear minutes after learning how to use the bow. As you may have guessed by now, I struggled on every single boss. This one was pretty hard because the fight starts out with this bow section and then goes straight into the boss fight. This means that any damage taken on the bow section will continue to be present when trying to defeat the Wood Knight, and that would leave me at a disadvantage. So every time I died, I gradually got better and better at this beginning section before I managed to complete it without taking a single hit of damage. Now onto the Wood Knight itself. This boss fight was, I believe, the turning point for me in terms of my own gameplay. As you can see, I started out this fight without even dodging or even bothering to shoot the courage crystals off its body. I was basically not prepared for this game at all, and while this fight was extremely hard, I slowly understood what needed to be done. I started parrying the Wood Knight's attacks and shooting the crystals off his body, but even though I was slowly learning, I was still getting nowhere near defeating the boss. That was until, after a few more attempts, everything started to fall into place. The parrying got better, the movement got more refined, and I was on a roll. With the Wood Knight finally out of the way and the first relic now secure, I was both excited and scared to see what the second relic had in store for us. The path to the second relic was pretty unique and had a few puzzles waiting for us to complete. The first shrine was relatively simple and required the use of the rots to move the crystals into certain places. The second shrine was one that I originally was stumped on, but eventually realised that these lights above the candles correspond to the order in which the crystals have to be shot in, and quickly cleared up this shrine. The third shrine was on top of this tree and was actually pretty difficult due to the sheer amount of enemies that spawn in, and also these moths that are pretty impossible to kill and deal way too much damage in a single blow. This one took multiple attempts, but I eventually managed to make it through and cleared up the shrine. The last shrine for the relic was also a pretty challenging one, as it spawned in one of the hardest encounters from earlier, but then also chucked in a bunch of enemies and called it a day. This again took me multiple failed attempts just because of how many enemies there were to deal with, alongside this massive guy just dealing damage whenever he wanted to. But luckily, after my first completed attempt at this group of enemies, I managed to also defeat the second group of enemies fairly easily and cleared up the final shrine I needed for the relic. After seeing yet another boss requirement for earning another relic, I started to understand why this game has the reputation that it does. If each relic had a major boss battle, I was in for a tough ride. Luckily, I found this boss to be pretty similar to the ones I had already dealt with, and after learning its movement and weaknesses, it only took me around 30 minutes to wrap this one up for good. The next trophy that can be earned is called Return to Sender and requires you to send back a mage's attack using a parry. This was the first time I encountered a mage, and it was probably not wise to go for this trophy so early on. However, due to the fact that defeated enemies do not respawn in this game, this only gave me a limited amount of attempts to try and get all the combat trophies before it was too late. The main issue with the mage is that they can heal themselves at about half health, and if you're not fast enough, then they'll just get back up to full health in no time, and all the work you did was for nothing. To combat this, you can use the rots to interrupt the healing animation, and this will give you more time to knock that health right down before parrying the attack for the trophy. Straight after the mage fight, I was able to grab another combat related trophy. For the trophy Bow Master, all I had to do was hit 3 enemies with the bind multi-shot, which was surprisingly simple. I promise you now, for me personally, this was the hardest boss of the entire game, hands down. It took me at least an hour, and yes, this was definitely a skill issue, but I found this one to be extremely difficult and a major challenge to overcome. I think what makes this boss so hard is the fact that there's constant smaller enemies spawning in on you while you're trying your best to focus up on the Shrine Guardian. This basically resulted in 95% of my deaths, as one of the smaller enemies would just get a lucky shot on me and end my run. There was one death that nearly broke me and almost made me reconsider even continuing this platinum trophy, just because of how close I was to actually defeating it. That was the closest I have ever been to needing a new controller, but I came back the next day, and on my second attempt, this happened. Defeating this boss was definitely a turning point for me. This was easily the hardest boss I have ever attempted in any game, and I knew that by defeating the Shrine Guardian with enough perseverance, I could defeat anything the game chucked at me. With this solid mindset and 3 relics to my name, I ventured back to the forest and used the 3 relics to summon Toro. This fight was not as hard as I assumed it was going to be, and I'm not sure if that was because it was just not designed to be super hard, or if I had just come to terms with the fact that every single boss was a learning curve that I would eventually defeat. Don't get me wrong, I still died an outstanding amount of times, but overall, I feel that this was probably one of the easier bosses in the entire game. I quite like the use of the rots to stun Toro, and I also really like the addition of the lantern to stun Toro for extra damage. After a few solid attempts, I finally had this boss pretty much sussed out, and went in for the kill, earning me the trophy Spirit Guide. And then we can finally find out what happened to Toro.
The explosion from the mountain shrine covered the land in darkness.
Saya! Where are you?
It lasted for days. I searched everywhere for them. I was their older brother. I was supposed to protect them.
The children know how much you care for them. What happened in the village wasn't your fault. You will always be their older brother, and they still need you.
This doesn't pop another trophy surprisingly, but it did give me some closure knowing that Toro, Benny and Saya are all together now, and that we were able to help them pass through to the spirit realm. Upon returning back to Satiire, we are briefed about another spirit that needs our help called Adira. On the way to Adira, we meet another spirit called Hannah. Her purpose is basically the same as Benny and Saya's, which is to pretty much help us along the journey to clear the corruption and eventually help Adira pass through to the spirit realm. To do this, Hannah teaches us how to use the spirit bomb, and in doing so, unlocks another trophy. The spirit bomb was a great addition to the combat, and in my opinion, is best used to get rid of those flying moths that continue to cause me trouble. Once using the bombs to figure out the puzzles on both sides, the door opened, and then we were greeted with this beautiful change of scenery, which I just wasn't expecting. And after reaching the tower in the middle, we can get a glimpse into what happened to Adira. Before a trophy pops for reaching the farm.
I can feel her presence everywhere.
As you may have guessed by now, we were tasked with yet again finding 3 relics in order to summon Adira. So we set off to find the first relic of the section. I did manage to grab a miscellaneous combat related trophy along the way for shooting a spirit bomb mid-air and killing an enemy with it. Before long, I had reached the first boss of this section, and before I could even figure out the next steps, I managed to accidentally grab another trophy for hitting 3 critical points in 3 seconds. Now, this boss was a pretty difficult one to figure out because it was an entirely new mechanic with the vines and it took a bit of getting used to. I will say, I love that every boss is unique in some way or another. Like, even though this boss is kind of the same as a few from Toro's section, the addition of the vines really brings another life into this boss fight. As per usual, this took a solid amount of attempts, but what kept me motivated was the fact I was already approaching the halfway point of the game. I will be completely honest, had this game have been 60 hours to platinum, I probably would have got burnt out eventually from always trying to play at my best. But with it being a 30-hour platinum, it was really just the right amount of time to enjoy this game at such a challenge. Then, I just had to clear the corruption in 2 other areas, which were equally as hard and amounted to numerous deaths. But eventually, I freed Adira's ox from the corruption and earned the first relic. Unfortunately, it wasn't entirely good news, as straight after earning this trophy, we were back into another boss fight for the second relic. This one was an exact replica of the Shrine Guardian, you know, the one I almost quit the game over, and trust me, when I realized this was the case, I was honestly reconsidering all of my life choices. This boss was the Shrine Guardian on steroids, and the biggest issue with this boss wasn't even the fact he was covered in a layer of stone, but was because he had this one move that basically always hits you unless you somehow dodge out of the way, and this accounted for like 99% of my deaths. To defeat the Stone Guardian, you need to use the Spirit Bomb to open up the critical points and then shoot the yellow spots. And if you remember from earlier, these yellow critical points turn into courage drops that boost your rot attacks. So basically, the game plan was to just spam as many critical points as I could and use as many rot hammers as physically possible until finally, after a pretty hefty amount of deaths, the Stone Guardian was defeated. To achieve the third relic, we need to go through the village heart. Once making it through the halfway point, there was another boss to defeat. I'm actually not too sure whether this is just a mini boss or classed as one of the bosses for the relic, but either way, this one really took a few tries. To have to deal with the crazy amount of moths, alongside dealing with the lizards and then dealing with the bigger lizard too, was just too much to deal with, but I wasn't going to let it beat me. I focused up, and after a few deaths, this happened. And then, single-handedly the worst non-boss area of the entire game was handed to me on a plate. 2 mages spawning multiple enemies alongside also spamming me with their red spears. This was actually extremely hard as there was just too much to deal with, alongside the fact that the mages can just heal themselves at any given notice. Yeah, that pause was me 10 seconds away from never playing this game again. But I persisted, and eventually, and I mean eventually as in an hour of dying, I finally managed to pass this area, and I never wanted to fight another mage again. Now that the hardest parts of this relic were finally out of the way, we could approach the village heart. Luckily, this area didn't actually include any final boss or anything, so it was just a case of making it past the waves of energy while using the spirit bomb to make a few paths. And then we could cleanse the corruption and collect the last relic to summon Adira. Just like with Toro, after using the relics to summon Adira, we have to defeat her corrupt form. And I actually couldn't tell you how many times I died in this section. There was a major learning curve with this one, because as you've already seen, no information really gets explained before entering a fight. And the reason why this fight was so hard was really just to do with how fast the boss moves, alongside the strong enemies that she spawns in after destroying the middle section with a spirit bomb. However, again, after around an hour or so of repeating this fight, I finally figured out that you can completely skip the strong enemies by blowing up the middle section as soon as possible. This explosion kills the enemies on the ground and results in a significant amount of health being taken off Adira each time with heavy attacks. After doing this 3 times, the middle section no longer gets repaired, and instead, she just kind of runs around trying her best to kill you, which ultimately didn't end up working in her favor.
Hana left to search for food and supplies to save our village. I watched her go that morning knowing I would never leave our home without her. Weeks turned to months, and she did not return. I had to help her find her way back. Somehow I felt leaving would make me forget her. The life we shared would slip away.
Even after all these years, what you built together is still a part of the land. Your bond will never be broken.
Now we can return to Satiire one final time in order to receive information on the final spirit in the game called Toshi. This is the spirit that we saw right at the start of the game and is what I believe to be the main cause of the corruption. Satiire warns us that Toshi will not move on quietly, essentially stating that this will be the hardest challenge in the game yet. We completely ignore these warnings and head off to the top of the mountain, seeing a quick glimpse into Toshi's life. Before he appeared out of nowhere, asserting his dominance on the land. We then end up in what I believe to be the spirit realm and meet the younger version of Kana. Now, this was a bit confusing to me, because if younger Kana is in the spirit realm, then surely that makes her a spirit too. This would essentially mean that the whole game occurs in an empty town, which would be a pretty cool plot twist, but unfortunately, that never really gets addressed. Instead, we rob younger Kana of her spear and head back out into the village, eventually learning the dash ability. This ability is extremely useful for movement and is something I ended up using quite a lot as I approached the end of the game. The reason for learning this ability in the first place is because Toshi has hidden all of his relics inside of the spirit realm. And to access the spirit realm, we need to dash through these gateways around the village. Of course, just so you know, there are 3 relics again, but these had to be some of the hardest relics in the game so far. You can approach these relics in any order, and I started by attempting the path towards the incense relic. Pretty early on in this section, there is a great opportunity to earn the trophy Piercing Blow for destroying 3 enemies with a single infused rot arrow. Again, I forgot to actually record purchasing this upgrade, which is my bad, but essentially, the rot arrow is an arrow infused with the power of the rots and deals significantly more damage than a normal arrow would. This trophy took a few attempts due to multiple factors, and to be honest, this probably wasn't the best place to attempt it, given the fact there was another mage in the way. But after a few attempts, I finally succeeded and earned the trophy. Just because I had earned the trophy though, didn't mean I was done with this section. This area was pretty unfair in my opinion, as the mage can just one-shot your health with a new ability unless you interrupt it in time with a spirit bomb, alongside multiple random enemies spawning and giving you a hard time. But even if you manage to make it past all of that, a whole load more enemies spawn in, including this guy from the start of the game. To me personally, this was 2 bosses in one, and maybe on par with the double mage fight from earlier. After a few unsuccessful attempts, I finally passed the area. Before engaging with the relic boss, there was just one more combat trophy to be obtained in order to finally be done with these combat trophies. To unlock this trophy, you have to get 3 enemies to pretty low health and then dash through them, hopefully defeating them all in a single dash. After dying literally 5 seconds into the fight, I wasn't feeling super confident that I would even be able to defeat this one. But I do have to say, these final relic bosses are so unique looking and are actually a breath of fresh air from the previous ones. As you've probably heard me say 100 times already, I died quite a lot in this fight, but I surprisingly really enjoyed it. I think that because I was so knowledgeable about the game now, I understood what needed to be done from the get-go. And this really gave me a head start when trying to figure out this boss. The main thing I learned from this fight was that the dash ability stuns the boss and interrupts whatever move they're about to do. And this was extremely helpful in taking the first relic boss down. Onto the second relic. This one luckily didn't have any pre-boss fights and was more about figuring out a few puzzles on the way there. Once figuring out the last puzzle, we could enter what was probably the best looking location of the entire game, and then meet probably the best looking boss of the entire game too. This was the best fight in the game for me, hands down. Don't get me wrong, it was one of the hardest fights I had come across thus far, but there's just a sweet spot inside of me for Japanese style games, and to see this entire fight revolving around that style was pretty cool. I think the hardest thing to overcome with this boss is just how much his attacks hurt. A single missed dodge will send you right down to minimal health, so it is basically just attempting this entire thing with no damage. And once his health bar reaches halfway, he starts doing this grab attack that will kill you if you're below half health. Except for that though, it was pretty much just learning the boss's movements and using the dash attacks to my advantage, while also trying my best to take no damage so I could spam rot hammers. This was an extremely long process and took an absurd amount of deaths before I could finally claim my victory on this amazing fight. And now, for the final relic of the game, we just had to explore the Hunter's Path, which luckily only had one pre-boss fight that wasn't really that hard. This boss was easily my least favourite out of the late game trio, as it was pretty impossible to figure out how to even defeat her when there was attacks coming in from all over the place. After a few deaths though, I understood that by shooting her head, you can just keep stunning her pretty much over and over again, which I'm not too sure is an intentional feature, but allowed me to pass this one relatively easily. Now that all 3 relics for Toshi had been acquired, it was time to head up to the top of the mountain for one last fight. This fight was surprisingly the easiest out of the 3 corrupt spirits for me, and I can only assume this was because I was now at a point where I knew exactly what my best strats were and the quickest ways to deal damage. This of course didn't make me invincible, and I still died a generous amount of times. But it was the fastest I had ever been to figuring out a boss fight, and it may have also been the fastest I had defeated a corrupt spirit, or so I thought.
Together, the Rot are quite powerful, but I have faced them once before. You may think you know these creatures. Let me show you their true nature.
And then we pop another trophy for reaching the mountain shrine. Yeah, I'm gonna be honest, this was not at all what I was expecting to see at the mountain shrine. I mean, just take a look at the size of the rock god compared to literally every other boss in the game. This was the craziest endgame boss I think I've ever seen, and I actually had zero clue how to defeat it. I spent the first couple minutes just aimlessly shooting around and attacking the rock god in hopes that something would work before meeting my doom for the first time. The second attempt painted a much clearer picture, as after shooting this crystal a few times, the rock god takes a significant amount of damage, and I knew that was the way forward. Of course, I died multiple times before getting anywhere close to defeating it, but I felt like I was on the right track. That was until this happened. There was a whole mini fight within the actual boss fight, and what made this so hard was that the whole thing had to be done in a single health bar, as our rots had been taken by Toshe. This meant that I basically had to defeat the first phase of the rock god by taking as little damage as possible, before even attempting to defeat this group of enemies. A few more failed attempts later, I managed to defeat the first phase without taking a single hit of damage, then also complete this mini fight without taking damage too. But I could not have been prepared for what was about to happen next. I was pretty concerned at this point that I might not actually even be able to complete this fight, because defeating not only the first phase of the rock god, but then a mini fight, and then on top of that, a mini boss battle, just felt like way too much to do on a single health bar. But I persevered, and after many attempts later, I finally beat it. The second phase of the rock god was basically the same as the first, shooting a few crystals, but this time making sure to jump over its laser ability to ensure I kept as much health as possible. After shooting the last crystal, we get teleported to another area, but this time, luckily with no enemies and instead a parkour section. I do believe that if you fall off in this area, you do restart from the beginning of the fight, but luckily I made it through in one piece and collected the rest of my rots as a reward. All that was left to do now was to beat the last phase of the rock god without taking too much damage. Of course, that was easier said than done. This section chucks everything at you. Smaller enemies, bigger enemies, moths, you name it, it was probably there. And you have to deal with all of this while also evading the oncoming attacks from the rock god. I tried my absolute hardest to stay alive in this final phase, because I could not bring myself to attempt this whole fight all over again. After figuring out that pulling these spears causes damage to the rock god, it was now or never.
So we should do nothing? You should take action.
The creature is connected to the balance of the land. Its presence, the famine. They are part of a natural cycle.
Satiire, you have the power to stop this. We should drive it out.
Put down the staff, Toshe.
I will end this suffering. This is it.
Your torment has lasted long enough. Nothing will change what happened here. You must forgive yourself so the land can heal.
Come, Toshi. Our time here is over.
The ending to Toshi's story was a great way to finish off this game, and to be honest, I was pretty sad it was over. It was pretty cool to see that the whole time Zajiro was actually a spirit too, and was the key to helping Toshi move on. All that was left to do now was to meditate at the final spot of the game and bring the last spirit back into this world. Now that the game was finally finished, I felt a bit empty inside. This was such an amazing experience, and I really wish there were more storylines to explore, but unfortunately, I had reached the end. The only thing stopping me from earning this platinum trophy was to do a cleanup run of all the collectibles I had missed. Starting off with the ones you're familiar with, there are 100 rots to collect in this game, and after finishing the story, I still had 52 rots remaining for the trophy. Another collectible in this game are called hats, and can be worn by the rots to add a bit of character to each one. There are 51 hats to collect, but I do believe there are a few more added to the game with the anniversary update that don't actually count towards the trophy. There are a few times where these hats can also be obtained when finding a rot, and it really made for some unique cutscenes. The other collectibles are as followed: 24 flower shrines, 10 spirit mails, 13 cursed chests, and 12 meditation spots. And because I chose to leave this collectible grind until post game, I didn't realize that the meditation spots permanently increase your health, so essentially I went through the entire game on master mode, only increasing my health about 4 times. Now of course, I'm not going to sit here and bore you with every single collectible in the game, but I will show you that I did in fact 100% every area minus the charms, as they don't count towards any trophies. The final area I chose to 100% was the village, but I did manage to unlock the trophy Zen Master for meditating at every spot before actually reaching the village. Now at the village, I grabbed a few rots before using the spirit mail to open this gate, which had the last remaining cursed chest inside. Unlike all of the previous cursed chests I had already done, these 3 chests progressively got harder the bigger the chest got. This meant that once I reached the biggest chest, I was in for a treat. To beat the unrealistic time trial set for this chest, the best way to do it is to bind a rot onto an enemy and then just spam arrows, causing the enemies around it to be defeated. This worked extremely well, and I ended up beating this chest with a very generous 2 seconds left. The next trophy I managed to unlock was for collecting 50 hats, which at the time was pretty surprising to me, as I originally forgot about the DLC hats and I presumed that there was still more that had to be done. I then decided to deliver all the spirit mails and had a pretty easy time for the most part up until the final delivery. For some reason, the trophy popped before I cleared up the corruption, but this area unfortunately still needed to be cleansed in order to collect the last rot of the playthrough. And honestly, this was not the easiest thing in the world. If you remember, all the way back at the beginning of the game, there was a boss called Kappa, and well, he's back, and this time 10 times harder. I wouldn't class this as the hardest boss in the entire game, but it was definitely within the top 3 or 4. The main reason it was so hard for me personally was just because of how many moths spawn in constantly, no matter how many you take down. But I wasn't going to let this final hurdle get in the way of earning this platinum. I actually think this was the best I've ever played in the entire game, and it was a shame that it had to be on the final boss. I was throwing my bombs perfectly, hitting all of my shots, dodging everything that came my way, and to be honest, once I got the hang of it, this fight turned out to be pretty okay. With the final boss of the entire game out of the way, I could clear the corruption and grab the final rot for the trophy No Stone Unturned. And then, I just had to use this forest tier to cleanse the final flower shrine of the entire playthrough. Every single collectible trophy in the game was now earned. So you may be wondering, why have I not got the platinum? Well, for some reason, I was missing a good amount of karma which is used to purchase upgrades. This was a common issue when the game first came out, and a lot of people lost their platinum runs because there was no New Game Plus to grab the remaining karma for their upgrades. I didn't personally want to dip into New Game Plus, as I wanted to earn this platinum completely in Master Spirit mode. So I looked around on YouTube until stumbling across this video by David Gabriel Rosu about a pretty simple way to farm karma post game. All you have to do is warp to the farm and then blow up this rock. This will spawn in an enemy, and after defeating it will grant you 10 karma. Then you just have to walk up to this other rock, turn around and return back to the previous rock, which will now be respawned. This allows you to defeat the enemy again for another 10 karma, and then just rinse and repeat. I needed 800 karma to purchase the remaining upgrades, and was currently on 275. So I had to do this a solid 53 times, which definitely sounds worse than it was. And after eventually collecting 800 karma, I warped to the best location in the game and said my goodbyes to what was a brilliant platinum experience. So, I can finally say I have the platinum for Kena Bridge of Spirits. This has been in the backlog ever since it was released, and to finally earn every trophy while in Master Spirit mode is a feat I never thought would be possible. Every boss in this game really tested my patience, and yet I managed to push through what I believed to be impossible. I would highly recommend giving this game a go, even if you're not one for difficult platinums, because you might just surprise yourself. Thank you all for watching, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye!